Grim morning, and welcome to the Grim. I'm your host, Kristen. On today's episode, we'll be opening the gate and entering the crypt of St. Paul's Cathedral, located in London, England. So pour yourself a midnight margarita, settle in, and prepare for the season finale of the Grim. One last dig into history. Honestly, I've been looking forward to this episode ever since I thought of the idea of St. Paul's Crypt first crossed my mind. It's one of London's most iconic sites, layered in centuries of history, mystery, and reverence. But before we descend into the depths, I want to take a moment to thank you for joining me this season on The Grim. This is my first foray into podcasting. I came in with no formal background, just a passion for graveyards and ghostly history. It hasn't always been polished, but if you've been with me since episode 1, I truly appreciate every listen, every message, and every quiet moment you spent wandering through graveyards with me. I honestly never expected the Grim to grow the way it has. I didn't think even a quarter of the listeners or subscribers we would have today would be possible. It's humbling. And as the season wraps, I'll be taking a short break to write, record, and quietly revamp. But before I go, I do have one small favor to ask. Please take a moment to rate the Grim. Our reviews have been a bit ghostly. If you've enjoyed hitting play each and every week, I'd be so grateful for your honest feedback. I'm not asking for 5 stars, just a sign from the veil that this journey is one worth continuing. Should we keep walking this haunted path together? Well, let me know. And don't forget the Grim is creeping along on Instagram, TikTok, and Etsy shop, The Grim Co., and even Pinterest. Yes, that's still a thing. I'll be sharing updates there over the summer, including hits about what's to come. But back to the crypt. I had the pleasure of living in London for several years, and to this day, I believe it's one of the most captivating cities of the world. Tourists often flock to the usual sights, the London Eye, Buckingham Palace, the postcard landmarks. But here at the Grim, we don't deal with the ordinary. We're headed beneath the surface, beneath the gilded splendor of St. Paul's Cathedral, into its crypt, where time hangs heavy and the air tastes of history and dust. The first time I stepped into St. Paul's, I was a student. It was one of the few days a year admission was free. I had skipped class to venture within, nervously wondering if I was wasting one of my 5 allowed absences on a whim. But the moment I crossed into the threshold, I was gobsmacked. The grandeur, the echoes of history. It was absolutely worth it, and ever since I've now returned, paying for entry. But St. Paul's doesn't just get you from what's within. It grabs you from the outside too. Through London's fog, a dome rises of pale stone in haunting grandeur. It stands today just not as a marvel of architecture, but as a survivor. A monument stitched from fire, war, and whispered prayers, where death walks quietly beneath polished marble, and the grandeur hides a crypt of bones. Long before Sir Christopher Wren etched his vision into the ash of a city, there was another St. Paul's. And in fact, there were many. The first church on Ludgate Hill was believed to be founded in 604 AD, a wooden structure raised in the name of Christianity's rising flame. It was rebuilt in stone, then reduced to ruin by fire, rebuilt again, then struck by lightning, and again by fire. The medieval cathedral that preceded the current one, known as Old St. Paul's, stood tall for centuries before it too was devoured by the Great Fire of London in 1666. A fire so ferocious it reduced nearly the entire city to cinder. Out of those ashes rose the St. Paul we know today, a phoenix in Portland stone designed by Sir Christopher Wren, with its iconic dome reaching skyward like a challenge to the heavens themselves. Completed in 1710, it would become one of London's most sacred spaces. During the long firelight nights of the Blitz, as London was pounded wave after wave of German bombs, the city trembled beneath smoke and ruin. Entire streets were flattened, neighborhoods vanished beneath rubble, and firestorms raged like a biblical wrath. And yet through it all, St. Paul's Cathedral remained standing, defiant against the darkness. In those terrible months of 1940 and 1941, London was bombed for 57 consecutive nights. The city's heart was scorched. But atop Ludgate Hill, amid the shattered glass and sirens, St. Paul's glowed eerily in the flames, battered, scorched, and yet unbroken. It became a beacon of hope, its dome piercing the smoke like a silent sentinel over the ruins. This was no accident. A team known as the St. Paul's Watch, composed of clergy, architects, firemen, and volunteers, risked their lives night after night to protect the cathedral. Appointed by Winston Churchill himself, they patrolled the rooftop with buckets of sand and stirrup pumps, dousing incendiary bombs before they could even ignite the timber scaffolding and lead-lined dome. Their mission was to make sure St. Paul stood standing. Sometimes bombs crashed straight through the roof. Buried beneath within the structure, one of them lodged itself near the high altar but somehow failed to detonate. Had it exploded, St. Paul's would have been reduced to memory and rubble. Royal engineers managed to defuse it miraculously because the process was so dangerous that it's whispered they never spoke a word the entire time. On December 29th, 1940, one of the worst nights of the Blitz, flames devoured much of the city of London. That night alone, over 24,000 high explosive and incendiary bombs were dropped. The glow could be seen for miles, and yet in the early hours of the morning, through the ash and smoke, a photograph was taken that would become immortal. St. Paul's Cathedral, shrouded in smoke, standing alone above the devastation. That image became propaganda for the British, yes, but also a symbol. A cathedral that refused to fall, representing not just a building but the nation's will to endure. Beneath it in the crypt, the dead kept a silent vigil. Nelson, Wellington, Wren, the forgotten tombs and whispered names. The Blitz shook the earth above them, but the dead did not stir. They remained, as always, watching from the depths. To many, St. Paul's is just a church. But for those who lived through the Blitz, it became something else. A monument of stone and spirit, a guardian over the fallen, and a survivor of fire. Today, the tourists shuffle beneath its vaulted ceilings, unaware of the sentries watching them from below. But if you listen closely in the hush between footsteps and flashbulbs, you might feel it too. That thin veil between reverence and ruin, between memories and ghosts. But the grim isn't here just for the dome and the sermons. We're here for what lies beneath. Below the great cathedral, entombed in shadow and stillness, lies the crypt, a vast and vaulted underworld and the largest of its kind in all of Europe. Spanning over 30,000 square feet, it's not simply a place of rest, but of remembrance, of reverence, of ghosts. The crypt is divided into solemn chambers, the chapel of the Order of St. Michael and St. George, and the chapel of St. Dunstan, and the chapel of the Royal British Legion, each filled with the echoes of devotion and duty. The walls are lined with memorials, from modest stone plaques to towering marble-clad monuments. Each one a name, a memory, a life once lived now sealed in stone. Among the dead lie giants. One, the very man who dreamed and built this cathedral into being, the architect, the scientist, the mind behind the marble, Sir Christopher Wren. His tomb rests in quiet humility beneath the cathedral he raised from the ashes. The Latin inscription above him reads, Sur monumentum requiris circumspice. If you seek his monument, look around you. A line so simple and yet so heavy. Because what Wren left behind was not just stone and cemetery. He left behind a vision. Born in 1632 in a time when plague still haunted the streets, and England teetered between monarchs and war, Christopher Wren was a man of staggering intellect. Before he ever laid a cornerstone, he was a scholar, mathematician, and astronomer. A founding member of the Royal Society, Wren wasn't just building walls, he was reshaping the very way the world understood space, proportion, and light. It was the Great Fire of London in 1666 that changed his course. When the flames reduced the medieval city to smoldering ruin, Wren saw opportunity in the ashes. Appointed surveyor of the king's works, he was tasked with rebuilding not just homes, but hope. He would go on to design more than 50 churches across London, but St. Paul's was his crown. Construction began in 1675 and it would take 35 years to complete. Wren would never see it fully finished, but he watched it rise, stone by stone, scaffold by scaffold, until its great dome pierced the sky. Inspired by the Pantheon in Rome, it became the second largest cathedral dome in the world. To this day, it dominates London's skyline like a monument not just to faith, but to its resilience. Yet Wren was not a man who sought glory. His burial in the crypt is modest. No grand effigy, no ornate tomb, just the quiet echo of his work all around a man who rebuilt the city of London we know today. Every column, every curve, every whisper of candlelight flickering across stone is his legacy. And perhaps that's the most haunting part. When a man creates something so vast, so enduring, that even centuries after his death, it still pierces London's skyline, a symbol of the past, yet that lives on in the future. No matter how one chooses to spend their time in London, linger long enough and you'll eventually pass through Trafalgar Square. Tourists pause there, buses crawl through it. The underground rumbles beneath it. Museums spill their visitors into it. It is, in every sense, the city's restless crossroads. And yet, high above the noise and motion stands a solitary figure most never truly see. A man perched on a column of stone watching silently from above. Unless you're on a guided tour, if you bother to ask who he is or find out. But his story casts a long shadow. Few names echo through British naval history like that of Horatio Nelson, a man who gave his eye, his arm, and eventually his life in service to the crown. But Lord Nelson wasn't just a war hero, he was a symbol, a myth in the making long before he drew his final breath. And fittingly, his story doesn't end at the sea. It ends in stone far beneath the grandeur of St. Paul's Cathedral, and a crypt more mausoleum than resting place, where he remains entombed like a relic of a vanished empire. Born in 1758 in Norfolk, Nelson entered the Royal Navy at just 12 years old. By the age of 20, he was commanding ships. By 39, he had already lost the sight of one eye and the use of one arm. Scars of service were not as wounds but as symbols. He fought with a ruthless precision in battles across the Caribbean and the Mediterranean, but it was at Trafalgar in 1805 that his legacy was sealed in blood and salt. There off the coast of Spain, Nelson led the British fleet against Napoleon's combined French and Spanish navies. He devised an unorthodox battle plan, cutting directly through enemy lines, and it worked with brutal success. The British secured a decisive victory, but Nelson would not live to see it celebrated. A French sniper's bullet pierced his shoulder and spine. He died hours later below deck whispering, "Thank God I have done my duty." His body was preserved in a cask of brandy. Some say it was actually rum, and it was shipped back to England. When the cask was opened, the spirit was gone. Legend has it that the sailors drank it to honor him, but others say the brandy leaked. Either way, the tale was passed into myth known as Nelson's Blood. His state funeral was one of the most elaborate in British history. Tens of thousands lined the streets, and beneath the soaring dome of St. Paul's Cathedral in the dark heart of its crypt, Nelson was laid to rest, entombed in a black marble sarcophagus, originally carved for Cardinal Wolsey, a man who never made it to his grave. Fitting perhaps that Nelson took his place. He had risen through service, not privilege, and now he rests among kings. If you're wondering why Cardinal Wolsey never found rest within the crypt of St. Paul's, it's because history had other plans. Once the most second powerful man in England, Wolsey rose high as Lord Chancellor to Henry VIII. He dreamed of grandeur in both life and death, commissioning an elaborate black marble sarcophagus for his own burial in St. Paul's Cathedral, a tomb fit for kings, carved for a cardinal who fancies himself eternal. But when he failed to deliver Henry's divorce from Catherine of Aragon, Wolsey lost everything. Stripped of titles, charged with treason, and dead in disgrace before trial, he was buried in a rush ceremony in Leicester Abbey, his grand tomb left behind waiting and empty. Centuries later, that very sarcophagus, cold and unused, was given to a man who had earned not favor, but immortality. Admiral Lord Nelson, the hero of Trafalgar, now rests in Wolsey's tomb, deep within the crypt of St. Paul's Cathedral. Where ambition failed the cardinal, valor raised the admiral. Wolsey's name was buried in shame, Nelson's carved into legend. But Nelson never quite stayed buried. Sailors whisper of him pacing phantom decks. Visitors to the crypt report sudden chills, disembodied footsteps, and the feeling of being watched by eyes long gone. Nelson gave everything to the Empire: his eye, his arm, his life. In return, it made him eternal, not in peace, but in presence. If Admiral Nelson was Britain's ghost at sea, Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, was its armored shadow on land. The man who crushed Napoleon at Waterloo, the soldier turned statesman who wielded both saber and silence with equal lethality. And now, centuries later, he lies entombed beneath the weight of London. In the dark crypt of St. Paul's Cathedral, where stone kings sleep and echoes outlive memory. Born in 1769 in Ireland, Wellesley's rise was not expected. He was a second son, unremarkable in youth, even labeled a dull boy by his own mother. But war has a way of sculpting legends from silence. By his early 30s, he was carving a path through India with ruthless military precision, defeating powerful empires and returning home draped in colonial victory. But it was in Europe during the Napoleonic Wars that Wellington's name became carved into history's bones. At Waterloo in 1815, Wellington faced the unseemly unstoppable force of Napoleon Bonaparte. The fields were soaked in rain and the air choked with gunpowder. Wellington held the line, calm and impenetrable, while thousands fell around him. When it was done, Napoleon was defeated, finally, fatally, and Wellington was crowned Britain's great land iron hero, the Iron Duke. But his victories were not warm. He was known for his discipline, his cold efficiency, and his absolute intolerance for failure. Troops revered him, civilians feared him. His personal life was a ruin of silence and duty. His marriage was loveless, his letters clipped like orders. He later became prime minister not once but twice, and though his policies were cautious and often cold, his power never truly waned. The Iron Duke did not bend easily, even in an age when his hearing failed and his world became quiet. He walked the halls with influence like a ghost in full uniform. When he died in 1852 at the age of 83, the nation mourned. His funeral was colossal. Over 1 million people lined the streets of London to watch the passing of his coffin. Cannons thundered, bells tolled across the city, and beneath the dome of St. Paul's they lowered him into the crypt, into a colossal granite sarcophagus, shadowed and cold, beside the empire he had helped forge in blood and steel. Even now in death, he feels immovable, a monument of a man turned myth. Some say his tomb causes the air around it to thicken, that visitors feel a pressure, a presence not entirely resting. Arthur Wellesley was no warm legend. He was iron. He was silence. He was a victory bought at the price too steep to be measured in men alone. And he still lies waiting, deep beneath the cathedral dome, wrapped not in glory, but in stone. On January 30th, 1965, the air in London hung heavy, not with fog, but with finality. The lion had died, and Britain, that aging empire of ash and iron, gathered to bury its last great roar. Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill, Prime Minister, wartime leader, Nobel laureate, was granted the rarest of honors, a state funeral, held beneath the shadowed dome of St. Paul's Cathedral. It was the first for a non-royal since the Duke of Wellington, more than a century earlier, and it would be the last for a civilian in the 20th century. Churchill had died exactly 70 years, the day after his father, Lord Randolph Churchill. He passed away at the age of 90 after suffering a final stroke. The world paused, bells tolled across London, and Parliament fell silent. The Queen then declared a full state funeral. And for 3 days Churchill laid in state in Westminster Hall, his coffin draped with a Union Jack. Over 30,000 people filed past in hushed reverence, some weeping, some saluting, all bearing witness. They came not just to mourn the man, but to say goodbye to an era. On the morning of the funeral, 6 days after he had passed, Big Ben was silenced, its great bell muted out of respect, a rare and solemn act. Churchill's coffin was carried on a Royal Navy gun carriage, pulled by naval ratings, not horses. Behind it marched a procession of soldiers, statesmen, and the weight of history itself. The cortege passed through the silent streets lined with mourners and memories. The Queen herself watched from a window, and the Ministry of Defense, out of respect, not precedence. Among the dignitaries who gathered at St. Paul's Cathedral were 6 sovereigns, 6 presidents, and 16 prime ministers, including Charles de Gaulle, Dwight D. Eisenhower, and a young Prince Charles. Inside the great stone cathedral, 3,000 guests waited beneath Wren's monumental dome, bathed in the cold light of that January morning. The cathedral itself stood through war and flame. During the Blitz, Churchill had insisted it to be protected at all costs. St. Paul's must be saved, he declared. And now that cathedral kept its promise, cradling the man who once protected it. The service was led by the Dean of St. Paul's with hymns that Churchill himself had chosen, including Fight the Good Fight and the Battle Hymn of the Republic. The choir's voices rose like ghosts among the columns. There were no grand eulogies, just scripture, silence, and the solemn sound of ritual. And yes, the Queen was there. It's tradition for British monarchs not to attend funerals of non-royals, but Winston Churchill was no ordinary subject. On January 30th, 1965, beneath the soaring dome of St. Paul's Cathedral, Queen Elizabeth II broke royal precedent. She sat among mourners, not as a sovereign alone, but as a citizen of the empire he had once held together with grit and oratory. As Churchill's coffin passed, she did something even more extraordinary. She bowed her head just once, a silent gesture from crown to commoner, from queen to a man who once led Britain through its darkest hours. No words, just that quiet, final acknowledgement. After the service, Churchill's coffin was taken to the Tower Pier and loaded onto the Hammond, a launch of the Port of London Authority. As the boat passed down the River Thames, docked cranes along the river slowly dipped. A haunting mechanical salute from the working class he had once both served and scorned. The journey ended at Waterloo Station, where a train, the same one used by Queen Victoria, carried his body to Blenheim Palace, and then to the quiet churchyard of St. Martin's, where Churchill was laid to rest among his ancestors. No grand mausoleum, no great monument, just a small plot of English earth, beneath a simple stone, a private end for a public man. I won't go into more of Churchill as he's not buried in St. Paul's. But his orders to create St. Paul's Watch to protect and save the cathedral was monumental for Britain during the war. Churchill himself was an extraordinary man, worthy of another episode on The Grim. By candlelight she walked, quiet, determined, spectral. To the wounded soldiers of the Crimean War, she was hope wrapped in a white shawl, a glimmer in the blood and mud of military hospitals. To history, she became a saint of science, statistics, and salvation. But here at the Grim, we remember that even Florence Nightingale, the lady with the lamp, moved through darkness long before she ever carried the flame. Born in 1820 to a wealthy British family, Florence was expected to marry, entertain, and to obey the quiet rules of high society. But from an early age, she heard what she called a calling, a voice, divine or internal, that insisted her purpose lay not in the drawing rooms of the elite, but in the corridors of the dying. Against her family's wishes, Florence trained in secret, studying medicine and nursing when such things were deemed undignified for a woman of her station. But death didn't care for dignity, and Florence knew that. When the Crimean War broke out in 1853, she was sent with a team of nurses to Scutari, a British-based hospital in Constantinople. What she found there was more horrifying than healing. The wards were choked with filth. Rats crawled between the wounded, gangrene spread like rot in wet timber, and the dead were buried too quickly, the living not soon enough. Disease claimed more soldiers than bullets, and so in the midst of this quiet apocalypse, she got to work. She cleaned, she charted, she demanded proper sanitation, fresh air, and running water. She moved among the dying at night, carrying her small lamp, the last light that many would ever see. They whispered of her as a ghost, a savior, a woman who defied both war and God's apparent silence. But Florence Nightingale was no ministering angel. She also was a scientist, a data analyst before the word even existed. Her charts, graphs, and meticulous records changed how the British military understood morality itself. Her legacy would go on to shape hospital systems, battlefield triage, and the very concept of modern nursing. Yet the light she carried came at a cost. After the war, Nightingale returned not to fanfare but to isolation. Worn down by years of illness, she spent much of her remaining life bedridden. She became a phantom in her own home, writing endlessly, her body failing while her mind kept her sharp and haunted. Florence Nightingale died in 1910 at the age of 90. She was offered burial in Westminster Abbey among Britain's most celebrated dead, but she refused. She was buried instead in a small country graveyard in Hampshire, her tombstone marked only with her initials, FN. No grand epithet, no marble angels, just quiet. But the shadows she walked through have never entirely lifted. And every clean ward, every sterile scalpel, every nurse holding the hand of the dying, her ghost lingers, not mournful but vigilant, a light in the dark and a reminder that even angels are forged in fire. In the quiet, dust-streaked corners of science, death has always lingered. It crept beneath the skin of wounds, blackened the lungs, filled hospital halls with the scent of rot. For centuries, infection wasn't a complication, it was a sentence. But in 1928, death met its match in something small, something unexpected, something growing in a forgotten petri dish. Sir Alexander Fleming was a reluctant savior, a man who stumbled upon salvation while others were chasing glory and chased the course of human morality with fungus. And like all great discoveries, it began not with thunder, but with neglect. Fleming was born in 1881 in the rural shadows of Ayrshire, Scotland. He came from a farming family surrounded by fields, damp stone walls, and the silent threat of infection that followed every scrape with childbirth. He grew up quiet, observant, and eventually curious enough to leave the pastoral hush for the halls of medicine in London. He served in World War I as a battlefield doctor, watching men die not from bullets but from festering wounds and septic fevers. The trenches were not just soaked with mud, but they were soaked with gangrene. It left a mark on him, a quiet fury. And when the war ended, Fleming returned to the lab with a singular obsession: to fight the invisible killers. But the breakthrough came, as often breakthroughs do, by accident. In 1928, Fleming left a culture of staph bacteria on his workbench while he went away on holiday. When he returned, he noticed something strange. A blue-green mold had taken root on one of the dishes, and around it the deadly bacteria had died. The mold was Penicillium notatum, and Fleming had just discovered the world's first true antibiotic, penicillin. It wasn't an immediate miracle. Fleming lacked the resources and recognition to fully develop it. Years would pass, but the mold's promise would eventually be refined, harvested, and multiplied, just in time for World War II. Penicillin swept across the battlefield like a quiet ghost, saving countless lives that would have once been lost to fever and filth. Death had ruled medicine for millennia, but with penicillin for the first time in history, humanity pushed back. Fleming never chased fame, but it found him. He was knighted in 1944, awarded the Nobel Prize in 1945, and hailed as a hero, not for conquering the enemy, but for disarming one. He died in 1955 at the age of 73 from a heart attack in his London home. No pain, no fanfare, just silence. He was buried in St. Paul's Cathedral, among the generals and architects of empire. But his legacy was not carved in granite. It lingers in the bloodstreams of billions, in every wound that healed. And yet penicillin is not perfect. Resistance grows. The mold that saved us now struggles to keep pace. It's said in scientific circles that we're returning to a post-antibiotic age, where infection may reclaim its throne. Perhaps Fleming's greatest achievement is not his discovery, but the question he left behind. What happens when the mold no longer holds the bacteria? Some artists paint what they see, others paint what they feel, but Joseph Mallard William Turner painted what haunted him: the fury of nature, the violence of time, and the slow erosion of empire, canvas by canvas, like a whisper from the void. He was born in London in 1755, the son of a barber, a common child with uncommon eyes. By the time he was a teenager, his sketches were already unsettling: moody rivers, fractured ruins, skies alive with silence and menace. He entered the Royal Academy of Arts at just 14. By 26, he was a full time member. But the more he painted, the further he drifted from the polite sensibilities of his peers. Turner wasn't interested in stillness or perfection. He chased something deeper, something elemental, something sublime. Turner painted fire, shipwrecks, fog, floods, and the disintegrated edges of the known world. His canvases blurred the line between beauty and terror. He captured the way the light cracked through clouds, the way the sea devoured wood and flesh alike. He painted London in flames, Venice on the brink of drowning, and the sun as a cruel, watchful god. One of his most chilling works, The Slave Ship, in 1840, depicts bodies tossed into a blood-red sea, cargo discarded to claim insurance. The water gleams beautiful and obscene. It's not just a painting, it's an indictment, a scream. To many in his time, Turner's late work looked like madness, color without control, chaos without form. But he wasn't losing vision, he was seeing too much. He once said indistinctness was my forte. And in that blur, he painted the truth. Turner never married, he had kept few friends. He lived with his father, who served as his assistant and closest companion, until his death, a loss from which Turner never fully recovered. In his final years, Turner lived under an assumed name, Mr. Booth, and a house near the Thames where he painted in near solitude. He died in 1851 in obscurity, muttering with his last breath, "The sun is God." His body was laid to rest in the crypt of St. Paul's Cathedral beside Sir Joshua Reynolds. The painter who had once defined the establishment, Turner dismantled, brushstroke by brushstroke. Turner painted the apocalypse as if it were inevitable, and perhaps it is. His seas still churn, his skies still burn, and somewhere beyond the canvas, the painter still watches, not from heaven, but from the horizon, where light meets darkness and nothing stays still. They say the dead rest quietly beneath St. Paul's Cathedral, but step into the crypt and you'll feel otherwise. The gleaming marble, clean to the eye but cloaked with something else beyond the veil, feels cold, almost sediment, as if it remembers every footstep, every prayer, every passing soul that never truly left. Stretching over 3,000 square feet, the largest crypt in Europe, it's a maze of stone coffins and names carved into time. The deeper you go, the colder the air becomes, as if something breathing just beneath the surface is there, something that never quite left. Some call it peaceful, but those who've walked alone down there after the crowds have gone, they know better. Cathedral staff have reported hearing soft murmurs when the building is empty, particularly near the tomb of Lord Nelson. One former verger claimed he heard the rhythmic sound of boots pacing back and forth, as though an officer were still inspecting his men. No one was there. Several visitors in the crypt's chapel of St. Dunstan have reported faint music drifting through the corridors, notes too low and slow to be organ music, a deep, resonant hum. One guess said it sounded like monks chanting from far below. The chapel has no active choirs at this time. Tour guides are often to point out Sir Christopher Wren's simple tomb, but few have refused to linger near it. One cathedral custodian claimed he saw a figure kneeling beside the grave, sketching something in the dust. When he turned the corner to approach, the figure vanished. No footprints, just the outline of a compass and a square drawn in ash. Visitors standing near Wellington's massive tomb have complained of sudden headaches, dizziness, and the feeling of pressure, as if something unseen were pushing back. Some say he doesn't like to be disturbed. Others believe it's the weight of his legend, still pressing down from above. When you step below the grandeur of the cathedral, past the polished marble, the echoing nave, and descend into the true heart of St. Paul's, its crypt, you see a hollow kingdom beneath the dome, where the living sip coffee and the dead listen closely. It's a resting place of titans with the tombs of Admiral Lord Nelson, the Duke of Wellington, Sir Christopher Wren, and dozens of others whose names once shaped empires. The crypt houses entire chapters of British history in its cold stone corridors. Each plaque, each monument, a whisper from the past. But time doesn't stop here. In the recent years, the crypt has changed and now features a modern cafe where visitors can sit just a few feet above centuries of silence, sipping lattes near the bones of its empire. It's quiet, reverent, and a little surreal. Cakes and cappuccinos above sarcophagi, the living and the long gone sharing a space in uneasy harmony. Even more curious, you can host events here. Dinners, receptions, private functions. Out of the vaulted ceilings, among candlelight and history, the crypt becomes a venue, a gathering of the present in the company of the past. It's beautiful, strange, it's unforgettable. But don't let the warm lighting and gentle chatter fool you. Beneath every footstep, the dead keep vigil. And while they may not speak, they never quite stop listening, especially while you sip your coffee. The grave grind for St. Paul's Crypt was a cappuccino from the Crypt Cafe. For more honorary grinds in the area, please visit www.the-grim.com. For now, we're closing the gate on St. Paul's Crypt, and with it this season of the Grim. We hope you enjoyed our dig into history, hauntings, and the stories beneath the stones. Be sure to subscribe so you'll know the moment we return from the dark. Until then, have a hauntingly hot summer. Until next season, hopefully, on the Grim.